The ventilation cycle was 90 seconds. Deka had counted it 11 times now, ear pressed to the wall where the housing met the floor, lips moving on the numbers. 90 seconds in, 90 seconds hold, 90 seconds out, which meant the life support system was calibrated for something with smaller lungs than hers, or slower respiration, or both. Anil Halstein, it went into the architecture she was building inside her skull, the only architecture she had left. Hydraulic release mechanism. She'd found it on the third cycle, when the feeding slot opened, and she'd caught the sound. Hydraulic, not magnetic, not electronic. The pressure signature came up through the floor when the door engaged, a faint tremor in the ceramic composite that she could feel through her boots if she stood in exactly the right spot. Late stage design, meaning someone built this before they understood what they were designing. The weakness was structural. She just needed a lever point and something to lever with. She didn't have either of those things. The cell was 3 meters by 2. The walls were ceramic composite, harder than they looked. She tested that with her knuckles on the first day, and still had the bruise to show for it. The floor was the same material, seamless except where the feeding slot housing created a raised lip along the base of the door. The light was sodium orange, the color of parking lot lamps in places she was never going to see again, and it didn't turn off. There was no window, there was no furniture, there was a drain in the floor that she had decided firmly and permanently not to think about in detail. She thought about the hydraulics instead. The door housing had a tolerance gap, maybe 4 centimeters where the frame met the wall panel on the left side. Even the factory gap, not damage. The gap that happened when a civilization built 10,000 of something and stopped checking the specs. Inside that gap she could see the hydraulic cylinder, the piston rod, the mounting bracket that held the whole assembly to the frame. The bracket was the weak point. The piston and the cylinder would hold, the bracket wouldn't. It was load-bearing but not reinforced at the join. If she could get something thin and rigid into the gap and apply lateral force at the right angle, the bracket would shear before the piston would. And if the bracket sheared, the piston would lose its mounting and the door would drop under its own weight. She knew this the way she knew field generators, the way she knew water pump assemblies and solar panel junction boxes, and the pitch of a diesel engine about to throw a rod. Pattern recognition, systems thinking, everything built by hands, any hands, human or otherwise, had a failure point, and the failure point was almost always where the designer had gotten bored. The problem was the lever. She'd tested the feeding slot cover, too flexible. She tested a piece of her own clothing. The cargo pants had a metal zipper pull, which was laughable. She tested her own fingers against the gap and confirmed that, while she could feel the bracket, she could not apply enough force with the meat of her hand to do anything except hurt herself. So she sat with her back against the wall opposite the door, and she named things: the wall material, ceramic composite, likely sintered, grain structure, visible under the sodium light if she looked at the right angle. The feeding slot, automated, timed to the same 90-second cycle as the ventilation, which suggested a centralized timer governing all cell functions on this block. The floor drain, she was not thinking about the floor drain. The light source, recessed panel, no visible filament, or LED equivalent, probably luminescent coating on a substrate. The air, recycled, faintly metallic, with an undertone she couldn't place, organic but not human organic, like whetstone in a cave with things living in it. Naming was control. If she could name it, she could think about it. If she could think about it, she could find the failure point. And if she could find the failure point, something was watching her through the wall. It had been there for a while. Deka went still, controlled, the way she'd learned in Mogadishu, the first time a vehicle had stopped too close to the compound gate and she'd had 3 seconds to decide whether to run or assess. She'd assessed. She was alive because she'd assessed. The gap was on the right side wall, low, near the junction where the wall panel met the floor. A separation in the paneling, maybe 6 centimeters, maybe a little more. Manufacturing tolerance again, or thermal expansion in the composite. She hadn't paid much attention to it because it didn't lead to the door mechanism. But now she could feel the quality of the air coming through that gap change, warmer, carrying a breath that wasn't hers. Something is watching me through the wall. It's been there for a while. It isn't afraid of me, which is either very good or very bad. Deka turned her head slowly, brought her face down to the level of the gap. The sodium light didn't penetrate far into the opening. She could see the interior edge of the wall panel, the shadow beyond, and then a sliver of the adjacent cell. Different light in there, slightly cooler, and in that cooler light, very close to the gap, an eye, human eye, dark brown, almost black, with a focused stillness that Deka associated with people who waited for a living, not panicked, not aggressive, the patience of someone who had been observing Deka's systematic assessment of her cell and had chosen to wait until Deka arrived at this discovery on her own terms. The eye did not look away. Deka did not look away. They stayed there, the two of them, for a long moment, Deka breathing, the other person breathing, the ventilation cycle moving through its 90-second rhythm around them, indifferent to the fact that two human beings had just found each other in the belly of something that should not exist. Then Deka raised her hand slowly and pointed at the door. She pressed her finger against the gap where the hydraulic housing was visible on her own side of the wall. Then she mimed the action, something thin inserted at an angle, pushed laterally. The shearing force, the bracket failing, the door dropping. She held up her fingers to approximate the dimensions 6 centimeters long, no more than 1 centimeter wide, rigid. The eye on the other side tracked each gesture. The person behind that eye understood mechanics, or understood intent, or both. Then nothing happened. For what felt like a long time, nothing happened. The eye watched. Deka's hand was still raised in the approximation of a tool she didn't have. The ventilation cycle completed twice. She could hear her own pulse in her ears, the stupid mammalian drumbeat that she'd been listening to since the lights came on and she'd woken up in a box that smelled like wet stone. Then a hand came through the gap. It was a woman's hand, brown, calloused, with grip strength that spoke of years working with her hands in ways that left marks on the bone. The fingers held a metal shim, thin, rigid, approximately 6 centimeters long and 1 centimeter wide. Both had been shaped. The edges failed later worked somehow, the tip angled to match exactly the insertion point that Deka had been miming. Deka stared at it. The tool was already made. It was already the right size. This woman had been watching Deka assess the door mechanism. She had understood what Deka needed before Deka had communicated it. She had fashioned the tool and then waited for Deka to ask. Deka took the shim. It was warm from the other woman's grip. The metal was unfamiliar, some component of this cell's own anatomy that had been worked into utility by patience and a knowledge of materials that Deka could not identify. "You already had it," Deka said. Her voice sounded strange in the cell, too loud, too human, bouncing off ceramic composite that had never been designed to absorb the frequencies of someone speaking English. "You already made the tool." The woman said nothing. The hand withdrew. The eye remained at the gap, watching. Deka looked at the shim, looked at the door, looked back at the gap where the eye waited. Then she went to work. The insertion point was exactly where she'd mapped it. The shim slid into the tolerance gap with a resistance she could feel through her fingertips, the ceramic catching, releasing, catching again as she worked the tool deeper. She found the bracket, felt the shim seat against the joint where load-bearing met mounting. The angle was critical, too shallow, and she'd just scratched the surface, too steep, and she'd bend the shim before the bracket gave it. She adjusted, breathed, felt the ventilation cycle hit its 90-second peak and applied lateral force. The bracket did not shear. She applied more force. Her forearm trembled. The shim rang against the hydraulic housing, a thin metallic note that the cell swallowed. The bracket still did not shear. Deka closed her eyes, felt the architecture, the tolerance gap, the piston, the bracket, the mounting. If I had to fail a point in her mind, like a knot in a rope there, sigh, right there, if she shifted the shim 2 millimeters deeper and changed the angle by maybe 5 degrees and pushed, the bracket sheared. The sound was brief, industrial, a crack like a cable tie snapping under tension. Then the piston lost its mounting. Then the hydraulic cylinder, with nothing holding the door in its frame, surrendered to gravity. The door fell. Straight down, the full weight of it, ceramic composite and hydraulic housing and frame, hitting the corridor floor with a resonant clang that traveled through the deck, plating like a struck bell. Deka felt it in her knees. The sodium orange light of the corridor flooded the cell, brighter than the cell light had been, and she was looking at a space she had never seen. Okay, she said. Her hands were shaking. Okay. What's the exfil plan? Well, the corridor was empty. She had expected guards. She had expected alarms. She had expected the immediate and overwhelming response of a system that should have noticed the door falling out of its frame. But the corridor was empty and silent except for the deeper hum of the ship's systems, and the sodium orange lamps stretching in both directions cast identical pools of light on identical gray floor plates, and nothing came in. The timing was fortunate. Somewhere on this ship, maybe close, maybe far, she couldn't tell, something was happening that had drawn the patrols away. She didn't know what. She filed it. Deka stepped into the corridor and started naming things. Junction box to the left, maintenance conduit overhead, deck plating with a visible seam running perpendicular to the wall line. The air was the same recycled metallic but stronger out here, and the ventilation cycle was different, faster, like the corridor system ran on a separate loop. Behind her, the wall panel in her cell shifted. The woman came through the gap she'd widened from the other side, not through Deka's fallen door, but through the wall itself, the panel she'd been working on long before Deka had woken up. She emerged into the corridor like someone stepping over a familiar threshold, calm, economical, already looking in both directions. She was not tall, lean, dark-haired, with a face built for wind and distance. Her clothes were leather and woven fiber, not modern, not medieval, something Deka's mental catalog couldn't place. Her eyes moved the way someone's did when they assess terrain for a living. Junction left, junction right, overhead, floor, back to Deka, then away again. She was already mapping the junctions. Deka was still naming things under her breath. They had been out for 15 seconds and were already doing completely different things. The woman looked at Deka. With focused attention, she was making a decision about how much Deka could be trusted to keep up. Then she turned to the left junction and started walking, and Deka understood that the woman had already decided which direction to go and was not going to wait. Deka followed. They made it 40 meters down the corridor, past 3 identical cell doors, all sealed, past a junction that the woman evaluated and dismissed with a single glance, before the sound reached them. Footsteps, heavy, coming from the cross corridor ahead and to the right. The woman stopped. Deka stopped. They both pressed against the wall. The footsteps grew louder. There was a secondary sound, a rhythmic scraping, metal on metal, something being dragged or carried. A man came around the junction corner. That is a very large man holding a weapon that used to be a different thing. He was extremely calm about this. Read the body language. Read the body language. He is friendly. He was enormous, broad through the chest and shoulders in a way that suggested he had been built by a life of physical violence and was entirely comfortable in the architecture of his own body. His hair was matted and wild. His beard was thick and unkempt, and his clothes were rough woven material stained with things Deka did not want to identify. In his right hand he carried what had recently been a containment drone, or half of one. The casing was cracked open, the interior components gutted, and what remained was a slab of composite material with an edge that someone had made sharp through enthusiastic application to the corridor wall. He saw them and stopped. Behind him a second figure stepped into view. Smaller, compact, moving with the deliberate grace of someone whose body was a practiced instrument. He wore something that might have once been a padded cotton gambeson, and his skin bore the raised welts of recent electrical burns in a pattern that suggested he had walked into something painful and kept walking. His face was calm, the face of someone who had made a decision about the nature of his circumstances and was no longer surprised by anything. The four of them stood in the sodium-orange corridor of an alien ship and looked at each other. The large man's eyes moved from Deka to the woman behind her, then to the shim still in Deka's hand, then to the direction they'd come from. His expression was complicated: surprise, recognition of something familiar in their posture, and the practical pleasure, like a man who'd been building a fire and just found dry kindling. The language was harsh and rhythmic, with sounds that Deka's linguistic awareness flagged as Germanic but not German. She understood nothing. The burned man behind him said something different, entirely different, tonal, clipped, with a cadence that was almost musical in its precision. Deka understood nothing. The woman beside Deka said something, also different, also utterly opaque. Deka looked at each of them. Three people from eras and places she could not yet locate, speaking languages she could not yet name, standing in a corridor that none of them had been born within 1,000 light years of. "You're human," Deka said. Her voice cracked on it, just slightly, because the relief was physical, a pressure behind her sternum that she had not acknowledged until this moment. "You're okay. Hi, I'm Deka." She extended her hand. The large man looked at it. He looked at her hand the way someone looks at an unfamiliar tool whose purpose they can see is important to the person offering it, but whose function is entirely unclear. His brow furrowed. He glanced at the burned man, who offered no assistance whatsoever. He looked back at the hand. It was an excellent face. The woman, the one who had been watching through the wall, who had made the tool before Deka knew she needed it, who had already mapped 3 junctions in the time it took Deka to name the corridor, turned away from all of them. He was looking down the other corridor, the one that led deeper into the ship, away from the cells, towards something she had apparently already decided was worth walking toward. She said something in her own language. It was brief and unhurried, and though none of them understood the words, the meaning was the oldest thing any human had ever communicated to any other. "This way." Then she started walking. The large man followed. He adjusted his grip on the drone weapon, shifted it to his left hand, and fell in behind the woman without hesitation. He walked the way heavy things move, inevitable, unhurried, absolutely certain. The burned man followed. His steps was lighter, measured, and he positioned himself at the large man's flank with the instinct of someone who understood formation without needing to be told. Deka stood in the corridor. She looked back the way they'd come, the fallen door, the empty cells, the sodium-orange light stretching into the silence of a ship that hadn't noticed them yet. She looked the way the others were going, deeper, darker, towards something she couldn't name and couldn't map and couldn't prepare for. She went.